All right, so cyberpunk fashion. We're diving deep into a world where tech isn't just something you wear, it's like woven into the very fabric of style. Neon lights, gritty alleyways, that whole vibe.
But it's more than just clothes, isn't it?
It really is. It's about rebellion, like creating a look that helps you stand out in a world that feels, I don't know, maybe a little too much the same sometimes. And what I find fascinating is how one film, Blade Runner, managed to capture that whole aesthetic back in '82, and it still resonates today, like over 40 years later.
Okay, so 1982, Ridley Scott blows everyone's mind with Blade Runner, and the fashion is just as mind-blowing as all that tech.
Mhm.
What is it about that cyberpunk aesthetic that still resonates, like with designers and just regular folks today? It's the contrast, right? You've got that sleek, futuristic technology clashing with this gritty, lived-in world. Very functional, with echoes of classic film noir, like those trench coats and fedoras,
Mhm.
but with a futuristic spin. Michael Kaplan, he was the costume designer, and he just nailed that fusion of elegance and grunge, high society, and street rebellion.
And speaking of, we have ye to talk about Deckard's trench coat. Come on, iconic. What makes it the ultimate cyberpunk garment?
It's instantly recognizable, and yet it's still practical for a dystopian, let's be real, rain-soaked Los Angeles.
Mm.
But if you look closer, that worn look, it tells you a story. Deckard's story. He's a Blade Runner, always on the move, constantly in the thick of it. That coat says, I've seen things.
Mm.
It's protection, utility. It's a symbol of everything he carries with him.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. We see trench coats everywhere now, but that Blade Runner vibe, it's unmistakable.
Absolutely. Designers are still drawing so much inspiration from that silhouette. You see them experimenting with high-tech fabrics now, playing with asymmetrical cuts. But that spirit of the original, it's still there.
Like its fashion DNA just keeps getting passed down. But cyberpunk isn't all about like trench coats and dystopian detectives. We've got Rachael, the queen of icy cool. Her style is totally different from Deckard's, but it just screams cyberpunk. How does that work?
Rachel's interesting. She embodies this kind of retro-futuristic glamour, those sharp power suits, those exaggerated shoulders. It's pure 1940s Hollywood. But then it's streamlined, made sharp, almost severe. And you got to wonder, in this dystopian future, why that nod to the past? It plays with this idea of control, manufactured beauty, a longing for a past that maybe never even existed.
And those strong shoulders are back in a big way now.
Totally. That mix of vintage glamour and futuristic edge, it feels very now, don't you think?
It does. Okay, so we have to talk about personas. She just throws the rule book out the window. Ripped tights, fishnet, heavy makeup. She's pure punk rock rebellion, right?
On the surface, absolutely. But remember, we're doing a deep dive here. And with Pre, there's always another layer. Yeah, she's got that punk energy, but her style, it's resourceful, right? It's about survival in a world where resources are scarce. It's
Yeah.
like she embodies that whole DIY ethos, taking what she can find, turning it into a statement. And that resonates even more today with, the conversations about sustainability, upcycling, and fashion.
It's wild how, even within cyberpunk, you have these really distinct substyles.
Right. And I think that's part of what makes it so enduring. It allows for so much personal interpretation. It reflects all these different facets of, like, the futures we imagine for ourselves.
One thing that gets me is the layering. Deckard's worn coat, Priest's mismatched layers, each piece feels like it has a story behind it, like their clothes have a history.
Such a good observation. Layering, texture, they're crucial to that whole cyberpunk aesthetic. Think about it. In a world where everything feels, I don't know, disposable, these clothes, they tell a different story. They've been worn, they've been lived in. It speaks to a resourcefulness that's practical, but also, like, totally stylistic. And designers today have picked up on that, for sure.
It's like there's an art to making new clothes look perfectly worn in.
Right. It's about creating that depth, that complexity. It tells a story through the clothes themselves. Leather, denim, metallics. That mix of textures makes it so visually arresting.
It's like Blade Runner gave us this whole vocabulary for expressing like our anxieties about technology, this desire to hold on to our individuality in a world that feels, I don't know, like it's becoming more and more the same.
It's like fashion becomes a form of resistance.
Exactly. And isn't that something we're grappling with even more today? I mean, think about social media, how much we curate our image, our whole online personas. Like we're all living in our own little cyberpunk worlds in a way.
That's fascinating. We're more connected than ever, but also more aware of how we're presenting ourselves to the world. It's no wonder this stuff still resonates. It reflects those anxieties, those aspirations. It's that tension between, like, craving connection, but also needing that individuality.
Like Blade Runner, they like tapped into all these anxieties we have about technology, but way back then, right? And now here we are living in a world that's even more connected, more digital. Like, did they know something back then that we're just starting to understand now?
It's definitely something to think about. And when you're talking about those anxieties,
Yeah.
you can't forget about where Blade Runner takes place, right? That gritty, rain-soaked, neon-drenched Los Angeles. It's practically its own character in the film.
You know, speaking of, I was reading this article, I think it was called LAZERorange, and it was talking about how Ridley Scott, the director, he drew inspiration from this real place called Kowloon Walled City when he was like creating that whole look of the film. Have you heard of
It's
that?
absolutely Kowloon Walled City. It was this ungoverned, crazy, dense area in Hong Kong. It was demolished back in the 90s, but for decades, it was this incredibly vibrant, chaotic place. Thick, like narrow alleyways, buildings practically stacked on top of each other, neon signs everywhere.
So basically like a real life cyberpunk city.
Exactly. And I think that real-world connection, it's part of what makes the whole aesthetic of Blade Runner so powerful.
Yeah.
It's not just some, fantastical world. It's rooted in something tangible, something recognizable, even if it's exaggerated, stylized with the screen.
Like they took this real world example of like urban density, like the chaos of it all, and they just injected it with this futuristic dystopian vibe. And it's like, no wonder it feels so believable, so immersive when you watch it.
Exactly. It's that seamless blend of the familiar and the unknown that pulls you in.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, right? Like, what will be the next Kowloon Walled City for cyberpunk fashion? What real-world inspirations are going to shape how it looks in the future?
Wow, that's a great question. But let's bring it back to Blade Runner for a sec. What would you say is like the legacy of the film when it comes to fashion? Why is it still the reference point after all these years?
It's more than just, like, cool clothes. Blade Runner, it tapped into something deeper, something about how we see ourselves in this tech-driven future.
Hmm.
It's about rebellion, individuality, using style to kind of navigate this world that's both seductive and dangerous. And honestly, the visuals, they were just that good. They've like seeped into our collective consciousness.
It's like the film gave us this visual language to like express these complex feelings about technology, about where we fit in this, rapidly changing world. So where do we go from here? What's next for cyberpunk fashion? It's like cyberpunk fashion. It's evolving right in front of us. You see those Blade Runner influences everywhere, but it's also changing, taking on these new meanings as we get further into, this whole tech-driven future.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about it. We're at this point now where the lines between like what's real and what's virtual, it's getting blurry. Think
Yeah.
about it. The metaverse, AI, how we're basically merging with technology in ways we never even like imagined before. In cyberpunk fashion, that's always been about exploring those intersections, right?
So our digital identities, our avatars, it's like they're becoming this extension of ourselves. And that's going to influence how we express ourselves through fashion, like both online A&D in the real world.
It's already happened. We're
Yeah.
seeing virtual fashion. Like people are spending actual money on digital clothes for their online avatars.
Mhm.
If that's not cyberpunk, I don't know what is.
Yeah.
And it's only going to get bigger. Imagine clothing that like reacts to its environment. Garments with tech built right in, or even fashion that only exists in the digital world.
It's like clothes are becoming this whole other way to communicate, like, this is who I am or who I want to be in both worlds?
Exactly. And when you think about it like that, I mean, the possibilities are endless. What will fashion even look like when it's not held back by like the rules of the physical world anymore?
It's kind of mind-blowing and honestly a little bit intimidating.
It's a lot to wrap your head around, that's for sure. But it's exciting too. Like we're right on the edge of a whole new era of self-expression and fashion that's going to be leading the charge.
So what you're saying is the next time we do a deep dive on cyberpunk fashion, it might look totally different from what we can even imagine right now.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of it. Cyberpunk fashion, it keeps evolving, pushing boundaries, reflecting all our anxieties and, hopes for the future, all in this one constantly changing thing.
It's amazing. Well, there you have it, everyone. We've explored those gritty streets of Blade Runner, broken down what's behind all those layers, those textures, and even gotten a glimpse of what the future might hold for cyberpunk fashion.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
It really has. So next time you see someone rocking that classic trench or a pair of cybergoth boots, remember, you're not just seeing a fashion statement. You're watching a whole culture evolve, seeing our hopes and fears for the future all reflected back at us.